Hi, this is Keith Hall again. Welcome to Economics 590, the federal budget process. In this video, we want to talk about government spending. We'll talk a little bit about all kinds of government spending, but really we're going to focus on the federal government. And we'll talk about the different types of spending, what spending looks like currently. And we start really with the observation that priorities are set in spending. This is very much an important role of government. And they are, of course, spending your money. They're collecting your money. So government priorities show up very much. We'll start by focusing on the federal government budget, which really is the focus for the course, but I want to at least mention non-federal government budgets. One of the most important things to remember about the federal budget is it shows priorities. Setting the federal budget is one of the most significant roles of government. They're spending your money, they're taking your money in revenue, they're spending your money. It should show their priorities. And the budget itself provides an analysis of expected future income and a detailed plan for spending for the upcoming year. That's what it is in theory. And quite often, the federal budget reflects a significant amount of debate, political debate, and it's approached with different economic philosophies. And sometimes these differences in this debate reaches back many decades. So to begin to get a handle on federal spending, let's talk about the different types of federal spending. It turns out quite a lot of federal spending is called mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that's set up by law, and it's set up to be spent automatically. So laws set eligibility for federal programs in place. It sets up the rules and benefit formulas, and then the spending just goes on an automatic, and how much is spent depends upon how many people are eligible for a program and how many people apply. It's called mandatory because it is just automatic, and it's not dealt with year after year. What is dealt with year after year is a category of spending called discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is spending that lawmakers control through annual appropriations acts. And in fact, discretionary spending is the sort of spending that most of us think about with government spending, and this is the stuff that's debated every year. The most important thing about discretionary spending, it requires annual legislation. So Congress has to actually work on discretionary spending every year, not so mandatory spending. Some spending is repaying debt, net interest spending. So debt held by the public in particular, it means the public holding that debt, they have to receive interest payments from the government. As it turns out, this is now a major share of the federal budget because we've accumulated quite a lot of debt. And the last budget category are revenues. Revenues, of course, are funds collected from the public that arise from the government's exercise of its sovereign powers. So, of course, revenues are things like income taxes, corporate income taxes, payroll taxes, etc. So let's talk about mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is budget authority that's provided by laws but not provided by appropriation acts. It's going to be important to remember that there's a difference between appropriations acts and other acts of Congress. In most cases, mandatory spending is generally ongoing. So spending is controlled through program eligibility criteria and benefit or payment rules. Sometimes these are called entitlements. The major benefit programs are things like Social Security, Medicare, etc. And rather importantly now, this mandatory spending is 2/3 of all federal spending. So quite a lot of federal spending, 2/3 of it, is now on automatic. It's been set up in law. It's not even debated much necessarily year after year. Here's a breakdown of mandatory spending. 38% on Social Security, 23% on Medicare, 16% on income security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, other things. Here are the major categories. And in 2019, the year before the pandemic, mandatory spending was $2.7 trillion. And here's just a little simple graphic that shows you how these categories of mandatory spending have changed over the past 10 years. So, for example, you'll see that income security programs haven't changed very much. Their spending as a share of GDP has been pretty much constant. But other things, major healthcare programs, have all grown significantly over the last 10 years. The spending as a share of GDP is particularly on things like Medicare and Medicaid has been really significant. Social Security has grown significantly over the past 10 years. Big part of both of these is we have an aging population, meaning the share of our population that's 65 or over has been growing and will continue to grow. People become eligible for healthcare programs, they become eligible for Social Security, so it increases the federal spending pretty significantly. Discretionary spending, this annually appropriated spending, is set or appropriated as part of the budget process every year. The way it works is there is an appropriations committee in the House and one in the Senate. Appropriations committee is a very desirable committee because it sets the annual appropriations. And the appropriations committee has 12 subcommittees. And not coincidentally, each subcommittee has its own appropriations bill and each subcommittee shepherds their bill through Congress, through the subcommittees, through the Congress as a whole, tries to get a presidential signature on the law. And most of the direct activities of the federal government are part of discretionary spending. Again, these are the things that you think about. Spending on defense, infrastructure, lots of things. But because mandatory spending has become so huge, discretionary spending is only about 1/3 of total federal spending. Discretionary spending and mandatory spending is put into budget functions by Congress. There are 20 general subject categories into which budget resources are grouped. This is independent of the appropriations committees. Each category is a set of programs with some shared purpose or activity. Could be agriculture, could be health, could be national defense. Some activities have more than one purpose, but these activities, these budget functions, are primarily set up based on their primary purpose. And occasionally you can have a large program that's split between two different budget functions. Here's the discretionary spending breakdown. You'll see half of all discretionary spending is defense spending, and the other half, generally referred to as non-defense spending, is a collection of all those things that you think about when you think about government spending. Spending on transportation, veterans benefits and services, spending on education, health, administration of justice, international affairs, just general government spending, housing assistance, natural resources and environment, general science, space and technology, community and regional development, training, employment, and social services. So a lot of categories here for this discretionary spending. And here's what the breakouts look like. 60 years ago, most federal spending was discretionary, dealt with annual budgets. It fell into these 20 budget function categories. Some was mandatory. Back by 1960, it was pretty large. Share was mandatory, but it wasn't most. And now it's grown. The mandatory is so grown so that mandatory spending is now about 2/3 of total federal spending. And then interest, because borrowing has been so significant, debt is accumulated, net interest payments, just paying off old debt, has been a major part of government. And I'm using the term paying off loosely because really what government's doing is using their debt as a revolving account. They're paying the interest, but they're not paying down the principal at all. In the prior graph, we saw how the level of mandatory spending has grown over time. With this diagram, we want to look at the composition of federal spending, sort of how it's changed over time, how this increased emphasis on mandatory outlays has changed things. This is an interesting diagram that you might want to spend some time on. It is a look at current spending, 2020, by major category, what spending looked like 50 years ago, and what spending will look like 10 years from now. So, for example, you'll see that currently the federal government spends quite a lot on Social Security. About 5.3% of GDP is spent on Social Security. 50 years ago, it was 2.8%. So that's nearly doubled in the last 50 years, Social Security. And it's going to get larger. 10 years from now, it's going to be 6% of GDP. That, of course, reflects mandatory spending for the older population. So this is a reflection primarily of the aging population. Larger share of the U.S. population now is 65 or above and eligible for Social Security. Major healthcare programs, that's probably changed the most. 50 years ago, federal spending was only 0.8% of GDP. Now it's over 6% of GDP. It's quite a huge growth. And it's going to continue to grow over the next 10 years. So major healthcare spending has become a much bigger share of government. Now, part of that is from the aging population, but actually, most of that is from just the rising cost per person of healthcare. This is rising healthcare prices. Rising healthcare prices has grown faster than GDP has. It's becoming a larger and larger share of our federal budget. And here we have other mandatory outlays. You see this odd-looking surge in 2020, well, that's the pandemic. Then you see the pattern with the discretionary outlays. Defense spending 50 years ago was 7.8% of GDP. Now it's about 3.5%. Will probably go down to 2.9% over time. Non-defense discretionary spending has varied some. You'll see a surge here, of course, for the pandemic. And this is a growing share of the budget. Net interest 50 years ago was only 1.4% of GDP. Pretty soon it's going to be 2.2% of GDP. That's a fairly large share of federal spending just paying off interest costs from prior debt. Of course, you'll see something here which we'll talk about soon. On the revenue side, most of our revenue comes from individual income taxes, payroll taxes, some but not a ton from corporate income taxes, and then other revenue sources. So now next, let's talk about state and local budgets. Particularly, we want to focus on the federal government's interaction with state and local budgets. First, let's talk about federalism. It's the constitutional division of power between state and federal governments. The 10th Amendment says that the power is not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. That language is not that smooth, but basically it means what the Constitution doesn't give as a power to the federal government automatically goes to the states. So, for example, states can collect taxes. The Constitution doesn't give them permission, but they're allowed to collect taxes because the Constitution does not ban them from collecting taxes. State and local governments spent about $9,500 per person in 2017. That's a normal year. I kind of reached back a little bit. But state-by-state variations are pretty significant. Geography seems to affect spending, demographics, history, other external factors. And, of course, state policy has a big impact. State policy determines the generosity of state service, government service levels. It affects eligibility rules for social services, tax policy. And differences, of course, between states can be maybe because of revenue capacity differing. Some states have more income or wealthier than other states. But here's what the breakout of the powers are like, federal versus state powers. There are some powers that are set out in the Constitution as exclusive federal powers: coining money, regulating the mail, declaring war, etc. There are some powers that are exclusive state powers. Conducting elections has been a focus lately. Establishing local governments, maintaining a militia, etc. Then there are some powers that are shared. Concurrent powers are powers that both the federal government and the state governments have: the ability to tax, set laws, establish courts, borrow money, etc. And federal grants, as it turns out, are a very important part of state government funding. About 1/3 of state funding, state money, comes from the federal government. The federal government is paying states to conduct a wide range of public policies. Over half of all state health care is paid for by the federal government, and over half of public assistance is paid for by the federal government. And the federal government can and does often encourage adoptions of policies it wants states to do through aid programs. There's something called a grant and aid programs, which are programs that combine federal subsidies with federal regulations to micromanage state and local affairs. And to give you an idea of what federal grants look like, federal grants are now dominated by healthcare. You can see the ACA, federal payments to states, has been a big part of that. But federal state grants are healthcare, and that's growing, income security, transportation, other things. And state and local debt has become a major issue in addition to federal debt. So we talked about how large federal debt is. We can throw on state and local government debt as well. State and local governments are not paying their bills either. They're borrowing a significant amount. Anyway, thanks. That's a brief summary of government spending.